Okay. Thank you, Brandon. And most especially, thank you for the invitation. I never realized until a couple of years ago how much my perceived self-worth depended on getting up in front of a group of people and talking. So it's very good to be here, both to share some information as well as to enhance my own self-worth. The topic that Brandon asked me to talk about is coping with variability and change in rangelands, and he wanted me to bring an NRCS perspective. I'll do the best I can, but a lot of it's going to be my perspective as well. From an NRCS perspective, without a doubt, the way that we are going to cope with variability or change or anything else is going to be via conservation planning. This really is kind of at the heart of what we do institutionally and have for 75, 80 years. We've gone through various iterations of this. We had the 7 steps of conservation planning. We had the 9 steps of conservation plannings. But basically, it boils down to 3 things. And those 3 things are, we do an inventory, we take that information and we analyze it, and then we make a decision, then we implement that decision and evaluate and adjust. And that's kind of what I want to go through this morning, is how do we go through those things systematically, and how do we get the information that's necessary to do that at multiple scales. And Sherry, if there was ever a social system, an illustration of a social system, it's conservation planning, because this is where people who do planning bring all of their social constructs into this. Thank you. At least I've got one. I want to start with a new tool that the Department of Agriculture has just released. It's called the CRMA Climate Resilience Mapping Climate Mapping for Resilience and Adaptation, CMRA. Just Google that. This is a really cool piece of work. And like I said, it only came out about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's really gives you a lot of information about climate, and it will illustrate climate-related hazards in real time. And the part I like about it is it takes climate-related hazards and puts them into 5 different categories: drought, heat, wildfire, flooding. And today I'm just going to talk primarily about drought. And the good part about this tool is you can easily go in and you can select your location. In this case, I selected Doña Ana County and got the hazard report for drought. And it quickly told me that our hazard, our rating for drought as a hazard is very high. And it gives you a lot of other information over here that may be helpful. And in particular, it gives you the annual loss rating. And that's based on a lot of different, pardon me, a lot of different sources of information. It says drought is a relatively high challenge for Doña Ana County going forward. It's got a whole list of variables associated with that: maximum temperature from across early century, which is 2030, which is certainly within the planning horizon of almost everyone in the room. Mid-century, the planning horizon of a lot of people in the room, and then late century, some of the people in the room Thank you. We'll be working on that multi-decadal planning horizon, but it gives you daily temperatures, annual temperatures. So it gives you an idea of what you're going to face over the next decade, over the next couple of decades, and over the next 7 or 8 decades. And obviously, I looked at wildfire, I looked at heat, I looked at flooding, and they didn't show up quite as bad. So I'm going to focus on drought for the talk this morning, but this gives us a good idea of what we're looking at going forward. The really cool part about this is you can actually get this down spatially to a census unit. So I selected that census unit that kind of overlaps with the Jornada there, just on the northeast side of Las Cruces. And we can get some figures from that. The drought annualized frequency is the same as for the whole county, but the expected annual loss rating is relatively low. That kind of baffled me for a minute. So I went back in and I looked at some of the data, and what's driving that high expected loss rating for the entire county of Las Cruces was their dependence upon irrigation water and surface water for irrigation. Whereas in this particular area, we don't have a lot of irrigated ground. So it's just going to be more or less business as usual. But again, we can come up for that particular census tract, which is getting it down to just about as fine a spatial unit for climate as we'd be comfortable with. We can get some ideas about what the daily temperatures are going to do. We can get ideas about what rainfall is going to do. And as you get further and further into this tool, you can actually explore how many rainy days we're going to have, how many consecutive dry days we're likely to have. So at least it gives us some probabilities for planning over these different horizons. Now, in our particular case, we're very lucky here because we have a lot of data about variability. And in particular in this example, I want to use forage production as the ecosystem service that we're interested in, and look at the production of forage or net primary production on the Jornada Experimental Range over the last 30 years. And we can see that on these, taking some examples here on a gravelly site, an upland site, the lowest productivity site, you can see that variability that goes from almost 800 pounds per acre per year, all the way down to barely 100 pounds per acre per year. Similarly, on a loamy site, which is kind of the mid slope, we see the same kind of trends, but there it goes as low as 500 pounds per acre per year, and it can go as high as 3,000 pounds per acre per year. Then we look at some of our clay sites, and again, the axis has changed here. We can see some years that we go as high as 7,500 pounds per acre per year production, and some years that we're down around 500 pounds per acre per year. Without a doubt, a huge amount of temporal variability and a pretty fair amount of spatial variability. Now we know that the difference in this the gravelly sites, the loamy sites, the clay sites, these different ecological sites are going to be different every year. And we can predict that just because of where they are located spatially, the soils that they have. But when we start looking at that temporal variability, then we actually start getting something that we can start calculating or bringing into our planning models. Not everybody's got this level of precision in their data. But if you go look at an ecological site description, or look at local experiments, we can get a similar data set from the existing information that'll tell us the year-to-year variability. Now, I'd like to sort of propose this, and one thing that we all struggle with climate change, especially planning for climate change, is, well, we just lack the precision of these estimates into the future. And I'd say looking at these, this temporal variability over the past 30 years, we don't need to predict climate change and the effects of climate change. All we need to do is take that past 30 years worth of information and project that into the future. If we just planned for this, I have no doubt that we do a better job than we have been doing. So let's just take these 30 years, maybe just randomize them and project them into the next 30 years and plan for that. There's also some other, so this is a really good year-to-year planning tool. Even within years, we've got some very good tools. An example here is GrassCast. I just downloaded this yesterday on GrassCast, and you can go to the GrassCast website, and it will actually tell you on any given day what the probability is that you're going to have the probability of annual forage production going forward for the remainder of that growing season. So we're practically down now to where we're working at weekly intervals, and we can make these projections at weekly intervals, knowing where we are now and knowing that history, putting that into the models and the climate projections, and we can come up with a decent estimate of what kind of forage production we're going to have on a scale that is similar to what livestock operations occur on. So we got all this information, and it's great. We have huge amounts of information. Our problem is not a lack of information. Our problem is getting that information organized and making decisions with it. Rich, I really loved it when you said it's a balancing act, because I had a picture of a seesaw in there. And I think the way to do this, and what I've kind of been working on for the last couple of years, is vulnerability assessment. A structured vulnerability assessment, being that a vulnerability is a weakness in the ability to respond to threats. And a realistic vulnerability assessment is necessary for what we want to do. I think we have to get past the idea that we don't have precise enough data to make some of these decisions that are important. We may lack that precision, but we've got plenty of good information to make the estimates that we need to make important decisions. I modified this figure a little bit. This flow chart here is pretty common in the literature, but I modified it a little bit and specified a threat, or put a place for a specific threat. Most of the vulnerability assessments that I've looked at using this model, the one thing they fail to do is they fail to specify what the threat is. And I think with that tool that I showed you at the beginning, along with our information on year-to-year forage production and the forage projections into the future at the weekly scale, we can specify a threat. And in this particular case, I'd say our threat is that we are not going to produce enough forage to carry our livestock. So we go through the threat, we define the threat closely, we determine the exposure, the likelihood of that event occurring, we determine the sensitivity, how that's going to affect our operations, our communities, our cities, or whatever. Out of that, we come up with a potential impact. And then finally, we look at our adaptive capacity, which all together determines our vulnerability. Threats are events that are going to cause damage and in general are out of our control. But just because they're out of our control doesn't mean that we can't quantify and reasonably predict them. So, we define that threat. We've got all kinds of different threats: invasive species, political instability in some parts of the world. And in general, I think climate change is the one that we as an agency and as the government are really increasing our focus on right now. Sensitivities, the degree to which those critical species and communities are going to be affected, and how that reduction is going to, in this case, how that reduction in precipitation is going to affect our forage production. I showed you an example of grass cast. Easy to get to, easy to understand. There's another one, the Rangeland Analysis platform, which has recently become a Jornada product. And how can you trust anything more than the Jornada? So, you know, there's the information right there that we need from a trusted, authoritative source that is transparent about where that information came from. So that's as good as it's going to get right there. Another one is out of Missoula, Montana Forest Service, is the Rangeland Production Monitoring Service. Any of these will work. They basically take the same data sets, use more or less the same models. They organize a little bit differently, and they give you a similar output. They probably work better in different locations. I think GrassCast probably works better in the plains and the prairies. Rangeland Analysis platform probably works better in the Great Basin. The Rangeland Production Monitoring Service probably works better in the Northwest. So we combine those two together and we come up with a potential impact. What's the likely effect on that ecosystem service or that social network that we're interested in? And I think this is a place where as part of that conservation planning process, whether you're a BLM person working on an allotment plan, whether you're an NRCS person working on a conservation plan for a client, whether you're a rancher doing your own plan, whether you're a researcher teaching or a university person teaching a course, we have to ask these specific questions. In this example, in the short term, is there enough forage to carry my cattle and get them to market this year? In the medium term, will overgrazing this year reduce forage production next year? And in the long term, will continued overgrazing change the vegetation to a less productive state? Like Sherry showed a good example, and with the response to that question, in the long term, are we risking an undesirable transformation? And then finally, how will these changes affect the ranch, the livelihood, and the community? Okay, short-term impacts. Specific question, if we stock at 100% of average forage production, and let's just say in this case, average forage production is on those graphs I showed, that middle graph, the average forage production over that amount of time was 1,000 pounds per acre. What's the chance I'll have to buy feed? Because in general, if you're raising livestock and you're in the position of having to buy feed to maintain them, you are not going to make any money. So we have 106 years of rainfall. Out of that 106 years, we had 24 good years, 46 average years, and 36 bad years. That's a pretty reasonable distribution for average. That we have forage production for 28 years off of the graph I showed there, 12 good years, 13 bad years, and 3 god-awful years that are just horrible. So, those are kind of what we can use to plan for. We can use those numbers to do these plans and to project those out into the future. And the answer based on that set of information is, if I stock at 100% based on forage production of 1,000 pounds per acre, I will have to buy feed half of the time. And Rich, I don't know, and any other ranchers in the audience, if you're buying feed half the time to keep your animals maintained, that's going to be pretty hard to make ends meet. Medium-term impacts. If I stock at 100% of average forage production, 1,000 pounds per acre year, what's the chance I'm going to reduce forage production in following years? This is some information from a paper by Alan Terrell. And we base that on broom some broom snakeweed grass interactions up at the Corona experiment station. So we actually went through and took all of that data over those years and calculated the percentage that overgrazing in 1 year is going to reduce forage production in the following years by increasing the amount of resources that went into broom snakeweed. The answer to that question is, if I'm lightly stocked, I plan on less than 30% harvest in any given year, chances are less than 20% that I'm going to reduce forage production in the following 3 or 4 years. If I'm heavily stocked, there's more than 50% harvest. The chances are greater than 75% that forage production is going to be reduced in future years. So we can go back to that graph of forage production year over year, and we can look at those different ecological sites and say, if we harvest more than 50%, if we plan to harvest more than 50% off of this ecological site or in this pasture, then we are going to have a 75% reduction of forage production over the next 3 or 4 years, which means further increases in stocking rate cuts. Finally, long term, and this gets back to what Sherry had said, which ecological sites are important. This is from some work that Amber Wyndham did for the Southwest Climate Hub a couple of years ago, and say, all right, if I stock at 100% of average forage production, what's the chance that I'm going to have increased shrub invasion? So we took all the ecological sites in MLRA 41, and which is just over in the area that the Malpai is in, and we ranked those ecological sites by their vulnerability to change with continued overgrazing. And what we came up with was it's not a quantitative risk assessment, but it is a qualitative risk assessment. We said, well, that sandy loam upland site, that's not really based on that state and transition model that we pulled out of the ecological site description. That site is probably least vulnerable to change. So if we're gonna take that risk, and if we're gonna push this system by increasing our harvest to 35, 40, 50% as part of our planning, the sites that we need to monitor are these sites that are in red. If we try to do our monitoring on these green sites, obviously we're not going to detect that change at the beginning. So that sandy loam site, if that's the dominant site on the ranch or in that particular pasture, then that site's relatively resilient, but there are other sites that are more vulnerable. So this can actually help us set up our monitoring system. So finally, we've sort of got through the whole thing about what's our vulnerability, what's our exposure, what's our sensitivity, and we've come up with some impact. But the biggest thing, and the one that's hardest, I think, to get people to deal with, is adaptive capacity. And that is, what's our ability of our social, ecological, and economic systems to change in response to that impact. And for all practical purposes, adaptive capacity is resilience. If we can adapt economically, socially, ecologically, then we have a resilient system. If we can't, then we're forced into that transformation zone, which means we got to get a whole new set of ecosystem services out of that particular piece of land or that watershed or whatever. So we can, using that combination of things like the ecological site descriptions with the state and transition models, we can look at what our adaptive capacity is and taking into account our particular situations. I think Rich had a great example there of, people get older, and your adaptive capacity as you get older and more mature is probably going to be less physically. It may be better financially. So, that's where we kind of have to, I think we have to be, we have to be a little more honest with ourselves about what our adaptive capacity is. And part of that honesty is actually going through all of this information and coming up with these qualitative estimate of the risk that we are taking. And it all comes down to how much risk can I afford to take? And also, I think as part of that adaptive capacity, some of the things that you're going to hear about and see on these posters over here really can enhance our adaptive capacity. I think a great example is the Criollo project, the precision ranching project. All those things are going to contribute to our adaptive capacity. But in the end, that risk assessment and how much risk can I afford to take is really going to be determined by that individual that makes those decisions. Finally, climate change is scary, in part because it's about things that we don't know. And having worked on this for 40 years now, I guess, to me, climate change is not scary for this reason anymore. It used to be. The part about climate change that's scariest to me is our inability to actually do anything about it. That scares me a lot worse than anything physical that could happen. A realistic vulnerability assessment can help us manage that risk. And that flow chart's a great example. There's software to do it. There's all kinds of different things that we can use to assess that risk. But it all comes back to getting a realistic assessment of the threat and defining it in a way that we can work through the rest of that model and come up with our risk assessment. The information that we have available is not hard to find. I found it, and I'm not very good at it. It requires some effort and some serious thought about, number one, what our goals are, and number two, what our adaptive capacity is. And that's always going to be the biggest unknown. Thank you.